and welcome to the MCS pre-scene analysis. Now, this is just an intro clip to introduce you to what the product range actually is and sort of, the contextual factors so that you can have the utmost confidence in the process for your exam success. So the first thing is that my name is Joseph and I am the MCS expert at Astranti. I write mocks for the MCS as well as offering, tutor responses to any MCS queries as well as F3 queries, and I also write portions of our study text in regards to the MCS and F3. So that is my sort of background. I've been, working with the MCS for around 2.5 years now. It's quite a few sittings so far. And I've had a lot of sort of knowledge around this kind of level for a number of years now before I took over as the MCS expert at Astranti. So you can find sort of sneak previews and video clips surrounding the MCS and exam success in the case study at my Facebook page, which is sort of shown at the bottom. If you search that, you will find, all kinds of clips on a weekly basis regarding the MCS, even when there isn't a pre-scene around yet. We look at some examiners' reports. Okay, so besides that, what actually is the pre-scene? Well, it's a video series first and foremost in this analysis. We go section by section, covering each page in as much detail as you'll ever be required to do. It's very speculation based, but ultimately we're using our P2 and E2 theory in sort of the page, like the wordy sections of the pre-scene to pull out all the relevant points, as well as, applying F2 to our numerical information in the financial section. So the key points, industry guidance and how that relates to the company, and also we apply the business models. This is done mostly in the strategic analysis, but there will be mention in each section when it's particularly relevant. We talk about extensively the likely exam issues based on applying all this theory as we go through. So there will be hints to you and sort of key focus points for you to pick up on as we go through. There's also, these sort of standout exam hints and tips that we do come across. Like there are some that we're speculating on, and there are others that are just huge indicators that I will 100% point out to you, sort of the given questions that will definitely turn up in one of the variants. And potentially that variant is yours. We then have the strategic analysis, which is a very focused business model to pre-scene sort of video and presentation. And we have the top 10 most likely issues, which follows up all this information with essentially the top 10 problems that are likely to come up in the exam, with the top 1 to 4 being almost a guarantee that they will be, definitely there. We have a pretty good success rate. I believe in the past 5 sittings, we have scored about 7.5 correct issues in the majority of the different variants. So with that in mind, you can have a lot of confidence in our sort of guesswork and speculation. And then there's the other ones near the top of that list, which are basically guaranteed to come up. So how is it going to work? We'll go section by section. We'll assume that there's no knowledge as I progress. So by that I mean you haven't pre-read the pre-scene. We'll be going through together as it was our first reading. If you've already read it, great. But I will assume that you have not read further on at any given point. The only thing I will assume is that you're relatively well versed in our F2, P2 and E2 modules, at least enough to be able to go back and revise a topic if, we mention that it's particularly relevant. What I suggest throughout this series is that you read a section and make notes just before, you watch it or just after you watch the section. And this will mean that you can compare and contrast with my speculations and sort of inputs, and this will give you the biggest and most well-rounded exam prep you can possibly get. So very much go with that. It's very, very useful. And as we go through, of course, I'll have my review. At each video end, I will sort of sum up to the best of my ability what we've covered and why it's important. And of course, the last two products, we'll be going through a full strategic analysis and the top 10 issues, which are pretty straightforward as we discussed in the previous slide. So, without further ado, you will now cut to the current MCS pre-scene for you to get stuck in with. Hello there again. It's that time of the year where we have another MCS pre-scene, and you are here with Astranti on the MCS case study analysis videos. So just an introduction before we begin these set of videos. We're going to essentially cover all the sort of stand out sort of speculation points of all the content of this pre-scene, and this first video is going to cover the introduction sections and the camera industry sections, right? Because the introduction is typically the context by which the entire pre-scene is based. So we get a lot of big sort of clues in this first section. So this will take quite a long time, but not to worry. There is plenty things to dig up and sort of analyze about this first section. And following on from this, videos 2 and 3 will likely cover the types of digital photographic equipment all the way through to probably the distribution channels. And following on from this, we're going to have sort of group strategy, structure, revenue sources and competition, and the financials all in the 5th and 6th videos, the 4th and 5th videos, and the 6th video is likely to be about the press coverage down here, which are often big signals as to what's going to come up in the exam. It's almost the freebies, so we'll have a look at those at the end. So that's enough waffle. Essentially, we're going to go through this with our MCS hats on and be as nitpicky and speculation ridden as possible to give you the best prep possible. So the first thing we can see is that Montel is a quoted multinational camera manufacturer. Now there's multiple things that we can pull out from this. They're quoted, therefore they're on the stock exchange, therefore they're able to raise equity finance by issuing shares onto existing shareholders or to the public. So that is an avenue of equity finance. And also, there being a multinational company, they are also going to have group account considerations. So your F2 is definitely going to apply in this sort of group-based structure that is likely to be the case when we get down to it. So straight off the bat, a bunch of important information. And essentially, also the manufacturer element is going to mean that supplier relations are quite important, because manufacturing at the lowest possible cost and at the highest possible quality, depending on market placement, is going to be key. So essentially, we have to think about supplier relations and also logistics. So a bit of E2 and P2 considerations straight away. And what we can speculate from the next sentence is that Montel are manufacturing high quality cameras and they're aiming them at professional photographers, apologies, a slightly bit wonky on the highlighting there, and amateurs who are serious about photography. So the immediate element is that perhaps we're thinking about a niche market, quite a small but maybe high income market. Perhaps they've got a lot of disposable income that they push towards photography if they're amateurs. But essentially, this is a very specific demographic and it's not a very broad customer base. And what this will do is exacerbate all the types of marketing, branding, and sort of strategic elements because they have such a niche market. So for example, if they're looking for a new strategy, perhaps Ansoff's matrix, they might have to look at more diversification elements or just a new market in general with a different product, because essentially they have quite a narrow focus at the moment. And if we look at this final aspect, their cameras are sold through specialist camera shops and upmarket department stores and electronic shops. So with this in mind, they are already pushing their product into the kinds of stores that the consumer base with a compatible income will be going into. It is relatively sort of consistent with the kind of pricing I imagine they put on their products. And next up, we get some contextual information about the location of Montel, the domestic sort of conditions. So this is again looking at our E2 foundational knowledge, where we're looking at what they have access to and what's important. So they have a developed country. So again, this is going to be quite a high-tech company, as we're seeing here. And they have a lot of leadership in electronic industries. So essentially, we're looking at a country that has all the kinds of aspects that are necessary to build a strong workforce, as we're seeing here, with a high standard of education and several universities with world-class reputations in areas such as electronics, engineering and programming. So this is pretty key when we think about staffing, learning curve, maybe in production of lenses or the design of lenses or camera bodies, that kind of thing. The sort of quality of staff they have access to is going to be pretty high. So in that case, what they're going to want to do is then have a retention strategy to pair along with this big plethora of possible candidates that they have from these leading universities. So again, we're looking at our E2, staff motivation, staffing retention, sort of learning curve applications where, if you have a consistent workforce that have the skills, they will gradually get faster, better, more efficient, that kind of thing. So again, it might seem quite an innocuous sentence, but actually we've got a small hint here as to what they could throw at us in the exam with a possible staff-related question. And next, we get the mention that they have their own currency. So immediately you might look at that and go, okay, they have their own currency, but actually this is a super important point that gives us, again, a hint that exchange rates are going to be quite important. Now, they're a multinational company, as we've already seen. They may have factories everywhere here and there, maybe some foreign factories. So accessing their different sort of supplies and perhaps sort of transaction costs might actually be really, really relevant because they have their own currency, and typically they're going to be delving into foreign markets as well as perhaps having some transfer pricing or different currencies being relevant internally as well. So really, really important to remember. And also we can see that the company law requires financial statements to be prepared in accordance with the IFRS, and also that they have highly developed rules concerning corporate governance. So these three things are these huge exam tips. These are like the sort of freebies they're giving out. I know I've mentioned that before with the media section, but this is like the really sort of simple sort of here, know this. So from this little paragraph, we need to have three things in mind. Exchange rate risk, so we're thinking about hedging as a technique, but also we're going to be thinking about corporate governance and making sure financial statements are prepared in accordance with the IFRS. So study your IFRS, make sure you know all the relevant information regarding our corporate governance, and have in mind that they might throw in a curveball with exchange rate risk. Really key for success. I imagine these will come up in some of the variants because they just wouldn't put them here otherwise. And with that said, we get to the final little bit, which is always here. I mean, I've looked at a bunch of MCSs by now, and essentially it is the standard reminder that you are a financial manager in the head office, and your primary responsibilities are associated with management accounting. And it mentions that you're situated between an SFM, so senior financial manager, who then, informs the FD, the financial director. And this is essentially the stereotypical mention they put in every time in the introduction. That's basically just saying you've done the OCS, or perhaps if you're Gateway students you haven't, but typically most of you have done the OCS case study, and this is literally telling you take this more seriously. You have a more broad role in this sort of case study exam, and you're going to be looking at more management aspects compared to perhaps the more sort of business unit aspects that you might have done in the OCS. So just keep that in mind. This is the examiner saying the MCS is a step up. So let's be ultra prepared. And moving down, we're going to come to a section on the camera industry, and I apologize in advance. I've had a quick tiny look at this beforehand, and it doesn't look like the most interesting reading you're going to have, but of course we need to know all about this, or at least try and pick out the bits between this walls of text on the camera industry that's going to be most relevant. So in this first little bit, it's typically telling us what cameras are, which is perhaps insulting to our intelligence, but no worries. So Montel specializes in cameras for still photographs, whereas there are some that comprise a stream of images taken in quick succession. So the first thing I get here personally is that there is sort of a differentiated market, a lot of indirect competition, because Montel is specializing in a camera that can particularly excel at still photographs. And it sounds to me, this is obviously just speculation at this point, but it sounds to me that they're probably not producing cameras that have these sort of stream of images aspects to them, focusing more on just the professional quality cameras taking still photographs to a really high standard. So this to me speaks about indirect competition, and also perhaps room for the company to move into, perhaps to broaden the range of cameras, or at least sort of, not fall behind. Perhaps they already have a range of these, which we're obviously going to come to. There's a section on what they sell, but it's just a speculation here. They might have a market to move into, and also it looks like they might have a very specific focus at the moment, which could be the basis for a question to broaden that focus. And next we have the earliest, it's just a historical paragraph mostly, but the most important thing I think from reading this real quick is that they're talking about the electronic sensors, which we will have seen in the industry pack if you've looked at that. If you haven't, I do really recommend it, but just in case you haven't, just a tidbit, Sony in the real world, they specialize in these sensors. They try to produce the most advanced and useful sensors for cameras, and they've actually got a statistic that's around half of all digital cameras are using a Sony sensor array. So with this in mind, we're thinking about possible specialisms that Montel could move into. Typically, if you've looked at the sort of camera industry at all just before now, you will have seen there's a lot of talk about smartphones sort of breaking the market and making sales decline, and having sort of this mid-range or low-range sort of cameras being sort of defunct. So you have to have this super high quality to convince people to purchase a real camera that's standalone as opposed to a smartphone. And these kind of specialisms might be super important to continue revenues flowing. So again, one of these sort of diversification questions, potential specialism, new project, new product, that kind of thing. We have to keep thinking about what the possibilities are, even though, let's be honest now, this big section is not the most laden of relevant information. It's more just helping us out, a bit like our industry pack, but maybe less detail. But with that said, without waffling too much, we can also see that a removable memory card is also pretty relevant. Maybe they could make their own. Maybe they need to think about having a third-party supplier of the highest quality to match their sort of approach to cameras in general, that kind of thing. But otherwise, this kind of paragraph is essentially teaching us what a camera does, and essentially it's not helping us in the exam other than just, our own sort of peace of mind of how a camera works. The only thing I might say at this point is that if they're talking about how a camera works, maybe they would bring up a question. This is, shot in the dark, but they might bring up a question about how a new sort of way of doing cameras could be involved. If you looked at the industry pack, sorry I keep mentioning it, but there's these mirrorless sort of cameras where part of the mechanism is taken out to be lighter. It affects quality, but there is a method by which to still maintain quite a high standard. Perhaps this is what they're getting at. Perhaps they're trying to reinvent the wheel. I don't know. That's big speculation here, but otherwise we're focusing on these small aspects of possible specialisms. And now as we move down, we can see a nice little diagram. Oh, apologies for that. You see a nice little diagram showing us what a camera actually does. And my thinking here, of course, is that if they're showing us what a camera does and showing it in great detail, maybe these kind of components will be relevant in terms of the question, or perhaps they're going to try and reinvent the wheel. Probably the former. We're going to talk about these specialisms, maybe being a sensor technology expert as well, like Sony. You never know. But anyway, so this next paragraph, we're going to be told that the quality of cameras varies significantly. So immediately we're thinking about the sort of cost leadership versus quality leadership aspects. Already we have hints that Montel are going to be on the quality aspect of that spectrum rather than cost. And of course, with varying quality, there'll be a wide range of prices. And they mention here that particularly the lens makes a significant difference. Again, we will have learned this in the industry pack that Astranti do. However, it's quite common sense. I mean, cameras in general, the better the components, the more, crisp the image will be. But as we move forward here, we can see that there's sort of more control and more precise results. And also the electronic components are also important determinants of quality. So piecing these sort of fragments together, we can see that Montel are probably on that sort of higher quality branch of the market, and essentially that will mean that they want the best suppliers and the most reliable suppliers with the best possible materials, especially when we consider the lens. But also we're being told that the electronic components are also important determinants of quality. And with this in mind, this is sort of, to me, very much a supplier question, because we've already got the hints that Montel are about quality. So all these different components, we have a Farland country that has these sort of electronic specialisms as part of the universities and these big companies. Perhaps, a long-term deal being agreed could be a question. The supplier relations, securing a supplier contract, logistics, that kind of thing. It all builds into the picture that this paragraph's building. So let's make a note of that, and then we can have a look at the second half of this paragraph. And as we move down, we can see that essentially increasing the number of sensors in the sensor array can enable the array to capture finer details. So again, linking back to this sort of sensor specialism that Sony have done in the real world, perhaps Montel could get in on that, especially if the number of them is important, because that means that there might be a high volume market versus the standard camera market. Say, for example, Montel sell, 100,000 cameras a year. This is just, I haven't looked at any figures, but just an example. If they say have 10 sensors in them, so suddenly you're selling 1 million sensors if you're selling to a rival or something like that. So with this in mind, perhaps it's a high volume specialism that could sort of supplement the income of the company because of the sliding sales that we've seen in the digital camera market because of the smartphone that was very prevalent in the industry pack. But before we digress, let's get to the end of this paragraph. Again, this section is not laden with information compared to usual, but essentially it tells us that manufacturers used to compete. Oh, that's awful. My apologies. In the early days of digital photography, manufacturers competed to increase the number of sensors expressed in terms of number of megapixels. So yeah, we've all seen megapixels in a camera before. The problem here, it says, is that the physical limit is that the more you put in to this sort of limit, or exceeding the limit, actually causes the quality of pictures to deteriorate. So again, perhaps it's high volume, but you can't jam too much into it. And that will mean that actually, in terms of picture quality, there is a limit. So despite the lenses, despite the components, there is a sort of ceiling on quality. And what that will probably mean is either Montel need to find ways to reduce the cost of their sort of ranges, or perhaps they need to find these sort of innovative ways to add value to their cameras that isn't just in the hardware. And we saw this a little bit in the industry pack, where the software is an increasing demand from consumers. They want to have the sort of software updates on their cameras post-purchase, rather than just have a standard software that gets outdated and becomes slower over time, which gives them the feeling that their cameras are sort of out of date within a year, that kind of thing. So perhaps we're going to get a software question. And this is just a bit of a thought or brainstorm. But if they've got these universities with these sort of really electronic, digital style degrees, perhaps they've got a code software, and that's going to be a new project. You know, think outside the box a little bit. We are going to speculate a great deal in this pre-scene, but to me, this is showing us that, you know, quality is going to have a ceiling. Therefore, Montel will need another way to add value, whether that's cost cutting or adding in a different area, like such as software. So now we've looked at that page. Oh, sorry, it goes pretty fast near the end. We're going to move on to page 4. And essentially, this again is a big wall of text helping us understand the history of the camera industry. However, I want to point out a couple of things as I read through here. First and foremost, we've got a pretty innocuous sentence here. You know, it looks pretty innocent. Digital cameras rapidly replaced film cameras for various reasons. So, Montel became a company in the 1920s, as we saw in the first page. I didn't really point that out, but if you're paying attention, it said 1920s. And digital cameras came in the 1980s. In the page above, it says. So that means that Montel have been in existence for the transition from analog cameras, so before digital, to digital cameras. And what this will mean is that they have experience in change management. And this could potentially be very relevant if we consider that Montel may have to face a decline in camera market and look to have this kind of different approach, or go into a different market, maybe diversify entirely. But having experience in change management is quite relevant. So we're going to put that down as our first kind of speculation about this page. As we move forward, we basically get a reiteration about how digital cameras are way, way better. I mean, feel free to read through this if you're not necessarily pretty confident on what a digital camera sort of has in its arsenal as a product. But essentially, it's telling us why consumers may want to, use digital cameras as opposed to analogs. Electronically is pretty much just way easier for professionals and for like the social media age. And also, we're looking at just in general, a poor photographer will be left with some good photographs once unwanted pictures have been discarded. So basically, just the ease and cheapness by which they can be used, giving us the idea that analog cameras are pretty much an extreme niche, or actually just completely defunct as far as cameras go, because everyone wants things to be electronic. So again, it does link back to this experience and change management. They probably aren't making any analog cameras anymore, And if they are, it's going to be a very tiny, tiny proportion, I imagine, because ultimately it's just the die-hard fans that aren't going to want these digital cameras. So nothing super standout on that paragraph. However, we do need to keep in mind that, they've been through this sort of transition and they could go through it again in the future. And importantly, just to keep in mind, is that the digital ranges are going to be far more, profitable and have demand for them compared to the old school cameras. As we move down, however, we see that they're mentioning this kind of decline that was seen in the industry pack. Digital photography has precipitated a decline in the camera industry. Photographs are often shared through social media sites, which limits the sizes of files that can be uploaded. Where have we seen this before? Haha. Well, actually this quality having a ceiling is coming back, but in this case it's not a physical limit based on the hardware, it's actually a limit based on demand. Consumers simply, on average, don't really need this hugely sort of impressive camera, because social media doesn't even sort of show off all those kind of features. The megapixels are reduced. So low resolution pictures on a smartphone or a budget camera are just way simpler. And this sort of hints to me that Montel are going to have to tackle this kind of consumer demand or sort of needs trending away from Montel's placement. So this is again going to bring us back to sort of Ansoff's matrix. In your E2, where does the company go? What's the strategy? Do we diversify? Do we penetrate the market? Do we go into a new sort of product range in a new market, or a new product range in our existing markets? That kind of thing. So immediately we're thinking new product, because essentially they're trending, or consumers are trending away from needing, these big sort of impressive cameras. And as we see this final paragraph, it comes up with a pretty confusing image, to me at least. We see the mention of smartphones, which I've already harped on about, I apologise, but has had the greatest impact on camera sales, increased to the point where results are deemed satisfactory for many users. However, it says who would otherwise have who may otherwise have purchased an inexpensive digital camera. Now, we already know that Montel are probably not making many inexpensive cameras, or at least not specializing in them. In fact, going for that quality leadership, going for those big professional level cameras as mentioned. So perhaps the sort of consumer trends aren't that impactful on Montel's specialism. Maybe it'll be a case of chopping off these sort of supplementary products like the inexpensive ranges that sort of just keep the brand in every market, but actually keeping that core professional level sort of market where they are dominant. So with that in mind, we have the caveat that, okay, consumer demand is trending away from cameras, but perhaps, it seems at least, sort of placement of Montel's main product, these professional level cameras, are fine. They'll do okay. They're still a cash cow. Yeah, thinking about our E2 once again in regards to that. However, we then get a point as to where, in general, worldwide decline of camera sales. So that's quite a broad category, just all digital cameras, so that will include the professional level. So as we scroll down, we get to see this graph, and then together with what we've just seen and what we've seen in the industry pack, essentially we're going to be thinking about actually, sure, the core product might not be a problem, these professional levels will be okay, but on the whole, as the whole of the industry, Montel just can't rest on their laurels. They need to find a new star product that's not just going to, rather they can't just sit on their cash cow forever, because at some point, you might have consumer demands trend away from that also. So these sort of smaller ranges might have a sort of disposal question. Maybe they'll sell it to a rival company, shut it down, or just try to look to cut costs on these other ranges whilst keeping their cash cow professional cameras. But also then there is a need to sort of diversify or have a new sort of product for existing markets. So keep that in mind. Ansoff's matrix, new project, new product, investment, NPV analysis, all converge into this sort of, industry trend. And to be honest, it's not very common for a case study sort of pre-scene to show us this much industry information. Typically, we make our industry packs because there's a complete lack of industry information in the MCSs, or the case studies rather. But this time they've chosen not to. There's a very specific reason for why they put certain things in, so keep this in mind. The decline in camera sales as a whole is going to be super relevant. So to me, that spells out red alert, new product, new project, NPV analysis. So don't forget to be, well versed in those core skills. How we appraise a new product potential, or the investment for a new product potentially, and sort of measure its pros, cons, and the sort of supplier materials, that kind of thing. It's very broad, right? Your P2 and your F2, just don't ignore it. Okay, this is super sort of standout as far as the case study pre-scene will go. So yeah, as we see now, we have the graph showing us this downward trend, 40%. And as we move forward, apologies, it skips pretty fast near the end of the page. There do, however, remain many customers for standalone digital cameras, and several specialist camera manufacturers exist to serve this market. And here we get the mention of Montel, and presumably their biggest rival, Kira. They're the largest manufacturers in terms of revenue from camera sales, and these two companies dominate, let's go to the next page, the market for high quality cameras. Indeed, both companies are fond of quoting the stat that more than 97% of all professional photographers, blah blah blah, use either a Montel or Kira camera. Okay, so this is giving us some faith, back to this idea that the core product, the specialist product they produce, is all fine and dandy. We don't have to, change the entire makeup of the business to survive. The professional level cameras are fine. There's markets for them, and Montel and their rival are pretty much, hegemonic. They are the kingpins of this market. So typically, we're probably going to see that range be perfectly fine, and it's going to be centered all around, these other ranges and supplementing this cash cow, making sure it's not the only revenue source, or profit source rather, for the company. Interestingly, both Montel and Kira produce several less expensive ranges to suit all needs. So again, this is linking back to perhaps these ranges are going to be the ranges that Montel and perhaps even their rival Kira will have to sort of analyze in a very specific way. So again, NPV analysis, looking at financial statements as to whether there can be some cost cutting, perhaps simply like certain ranges are impacting the financial statement too negatively compared to others. There's a range of ways they could frame this type of question, but essentially we're going to be looking at some questions probably surrounding some less profitable or perhaps unprofitable product ranges that need to be sort of resolved either by cost cutting or just discontinued, because there's obviously some demand, those who cannot afford thousands of dollars. However, we've already just heard about the smartphone giving rise to a sort of consumer demand that's pretty small for these less impressive cameras. So, we have to think about the sort of negative aspect of getting rid of ranges. They also say that those companies also sell the most expensive cameras in those market segments. Again, on the basis of quality, they're advertising them. So again, if they're not even the cheapest in that market, perhaps there's a problem here. Or alternatively, perhaps being the best possible camera in that market segment is the only saving grace. And actually people can see a difference in quality versus a smartphone. It's a bit up in the air at this point, but to speculate once again on this kind of aspect, we're probably looking at sort of diversification, new product, maybe a new market. And we get another mention that there are several other camera manufacturers, some of whom produce very inexpensive models for purchase by consumers who either have a limit... Oh no, apologies again. So, by consumers who have either a very limited budget or who simply feel more comfortable traveling with a cheap camera. Okay, so there is demand for these inexpensive models, but when you factor in the smartphone, some of these other manufacturers are probably going to be in trouble. My speculation here is, other than there being some other competition in those markets, I actually think perhaps Montel could, in theory, have a sort of acquisition question because of the fact that those camera manufacturers who focus on the market segments that are being competed with most ferociously with this smartphone rise, they are probably in trouble financially. And so Montel could acquire them and perhaps add a sort of spin between the sort of pros of that inexpensive model and sort of add some Montel quality perhaps, and come up with a product that can compete with the smartphone in a very specific way, perhaps being really low cost as well as really high quality. Sort of the merger style sort of management aspects where they sort of create the most efficient business unit following acquisition. Maybe that's a bit too far, maybe that's more F3 than F2, but just keep it in mind, acquisition could come up if those other manufacturers are pretty poor in terms of finances. And we get a mention here that other manufacturers produce cameras in the middle range with products that come close to those of Montel and Kira in terms of quality, but at slightly lower prices. So again, competition may be pretty strong in that market segment that's perhaps between the smartphone and the professional. That sort of gap where there's probably some demand. I imagine there has to be, otherwise they wouldn't produce them. And other manufacturers wouldn't do so either. So this middle range that perhaps is for enthusiasts, they're going to be close to Montel and Kira. So perhaps we're going to get a question about how Montel can translate their sort of professional level leadership with Kira into dominating the middle range as well, so they don't lose customers to sort of lower priced rivals. That kind of thing. I mean, sort of competitive advantage, that style of question could definitely come up. Again, we're looking at E2, perhaps a little bit of P2, if we're looking at like maybe cost cutting or efficiencies in sort of accounting and manufacturing. But importantly, really importantly, none of these other manufacturers make any cameras aimed at the professional market. That's real good. But what if they did? So perhaps a question could be the sort of middle range competition creating their own professional camera. That would be pretty interesting as far as the question goes. And then again, that would bring up the question for Montel of how they react. What's the strategic sort of aspects? Do they cut costs? Do they go for more software? Do they find a new product entirely? Do they sort of acquire a rival? That kind of thing. I mean, it basically we're looking at these pessimistic scenarios really, but whether Montel, what their reaction is to this kind of challenge in their home market outside of just Kira. Though with that in mind, perhaps it's a far cry given that we've got this 97 statistic up here. But alas, we have a bunch of things to note down here, so let's recap. So we have this idea that perhaps they're less of a market leader in the non-professional ranges, and also what would happen if those more competitive middle range companies decided to produce their own professional camera. Something to think about. And finally, in terms of this video and this paragraph that we're seeing here, there are some niche manufacturers whose products are not in direct competition, but don't forget, indirect competition is a thing. It does eat away at certain demographics and markets. RugCam manufactures miniature cameras for extreme sports enthusiasts. Now, given this image here and our sentence, let's be real now. This is GoPro. And it's very interesting when we consider the industry pack, because GoPro attempted to sort of take their own product, which is this small attachable camera that's durable and able to capture really, really high quality footage of extreme sort of hobbies and sports and stuff, being attached to the person or their sort of maybe surfboard, that kind of thing. They've tried to turn it into maybe drones, and that's failed. So maybe this is the sort of creative peak of high quality cameras. Perhaps you can't push that kind of thing further, but importantly, when we see this mention of RugCam or GoPro in real terms, these might be an acquisition target because they're not directly affected by the same sort of issues smartphones have in regards to them decimating maybe the mid to low range of cameras, because you can't attach your smartphone to a surfboard and have it survive and take good footage. So perhaps Montel will want to move into these more niche markets that have demand and have proven track records with RugCam or GoPro in this instance, and maybe launch an acquisition bid. In fact, we've seen in real life that GoPro have courted a number of bids, none successful so far, I don't believe, but actually, they've explored the idea of selling up to a larger camera manufacturer as part of their product range. So again, we have all this sort of information telling us that Montel need a sort of new star product that's going to perform a pretty positive role financially for them. Perhaps these extreme sports cameras are going to be super, super relevant. I mean, they wouldn't mention them explicitly if there wasn't some relevance. Typically, these pre-scenes only mention direct competition. So with this in mind, possible acquisition. So to recap, we have external competition, potentially a new market, and with this in mind, RugCam could be a really good acquisition to solve market decline on their non-professional ranges, sort of replacing the support and the effort directed at these cheap cameras and actually focus it into these more niche markets that have a very specific use and requirement, which something like a smartphone just couldn't even begin to compete with because of just the reality of the two products. And there's a mention that very small numbers of manufacturers continue to sell film cameras. We know this is a super niche market. We haven't yet seen whether Montel do this kind of range, but typically this is going to be sort of a futile kind of aspect, I imagine, given our previous information. And this brings us to the end of this video. Video 2 is going to look at types of digital photographic equipment, so stay tuned for that video if you've got the time, or you can obviously pause here and pick me up another time. But I hope you found those first few pages enlightening. It's really important to pick up on those big red flags. It's not the most interesting opening section, it never really is, but it has so much important information. So keep that in mind, and I will see you for video 2. Hello, it's me again. I just wanted to take a few minutes of your time to first extend my hope that you enjoyed the free sample that you've just viewed, but also to just sort of explain what else Astranti do to help you pass your exam really effectively, provided you found our sample particularly interesting and insightful, of course. So, of course, we have a study text for every module, ranging from P1 to F3, and the certificate level is also free on our website. So we have study texts throughout the CIMA course, every module you could hope to study. The certificate level are free, as I mentioned, and then the rest of them, ranging from P1 to F3, are all available to purchase. Alongside this, if you're not so much a study text kind of student and you prefer a visual way of learning, we have the course videos. We essentially break down the study text into bite-sized presentations with a walkthrough, and it's a very, very, very engaging way of explaining the course. Following this, we have the pre-scene analysis, where we break down each pre-scene sitting into a number of videos, going through the whole document, but also adding a top 10 recommendations for what will come up in the exam, and also a strategic analysis where we put all the models you'd find in E2, for example, to the pre-scene itself, whichever that may be at the time. Alongside this, we provide an industry analysis. This is a document and accompanying video which help you give that contextual information in your exam. So, for example, if the pre-scene's on the oil industry, the industry analysis will break down the oil industry, the current topics, trends, issues, what the competitive market looks like, all those kind of aspects, all condensed into one so you can spend your time wisely in your study period. Following on from this, when you actually want to practice all this knowledge, we have mock exams for all of our materials. So StudyText has a generic mock exam based on the module, whereas the pre-scene analysis has mocks available to purchase that are based on that specific pre-scene, that are targeted to the key issues we believe will come up. And if you're not content with just doing those mock exams and practicing that way, we have a marking and feedback system where you can purchase the ability to send in your paper, have it marked by a CIMA qualified accountant, and get personalized feedback on whether you can improve X or Y area. And sort of finally, if you will, if you're feeling really underprepared and that exam is coming really, really soon, the masterclasses are offered by Astranti, and they're essentially a crash course in anything you could want for that topic. So if it's a masterclass on the pre-scene, it's going to give you absolutely everything that you could possibly need to know about the pre-scene in one rather really condensed sitting. Likewise, if it was the F3 masterclass, you would have all of F3 gone through in a very crash course style presentation and video link. You can also purchase it post-stream as opposed to viewing it live, all these kind of aspects. We are very, very confident that these materials will help you get the exam success that you want. So we have a pass guarantee. Provided you fill out a form which demonstrates that you have utilized our materials to a large extent and actually taken the time to study them, and you have unfortunately failed, we will offer you the same materials again for the next sitting as a consolidatory offer to ensure that you can get back on the horse and get that exam grade that you want. With that said, thank you very much for watching the sample video. I hope you enjoyed it and it gives you a lot of confidence in Astranti and your CIMA future.